Hello and welcome to the Seren Stay-at-Home Series archive. In this video, Alexandra Ford reads from her debut novel, What Remains at the End, and discusses her personal connection to its subject matter. We hope you enjoy watching it back.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, from the looks of it, Alexandra hardly needs any introduction to you. But there we are, I'll do my best. So I'm Mick. I work at Seren. I had the pleasure of helping edit Alexandra's novel last year, I'm guessing. You all know, I mean, she lives on the borders now, on the borders between Wales and England, and works at the Alvin Foundation, and is also bucolically raising sheep. If you're following her Twitter feed at the moment, you'll know all about that and see them posing by the washing machine and who knows where else. And that really is quite a long way away from What Remains at the End, Alexandra's debut novel, which I'm guessing you've all read. If you haven't read it, wave. Okay, so you barely need me to tell you then that it's kind of 2 or 3 stories interwoven, family, contemporary relationship, which is informed by a kind of historical story, which is an episode of European history, which the novel kind of bears witness to as well. So I'm gonna, you all know all this, so I'm just going to pass you over to Alexandra to make hay. Oh, I am also going to say that actually at 8 o'clock I'm going to have to leave. So if I disappear from the screen, then you'll know why. But great to see you all here. And Alexandra.
Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction, Mick. And thank you, Sarah, for hosting. I do see, I know there's a lot of friends here, which is amazing. Thank you so much. I also know that there's some unfamiliar faces and new faces. So thank you for coming as well. I think sort of one of the really interesting things about these difficult times is the way we can connect in spite of distance and borders. And it's, wonderful to see people from both the UK and the US here. So thank you. Mick did a great job, of course, introducing sort of my strange life and this book. I'll talk a little bit about the book. I'll read a short excerpt, talk a little bit more about the book, and then I'll read a bit more, and then open the virtual floor to questions, which again, of course, is probably a little bit of a challenge because I know a lot of you are very familiar with this work. But of course, the novel What Remains at the End is it follows a young woman named Marie as she's going through a really sort of difficult time in her life. She's grappling with the loss of her grandfather. Her grandmother has Alzheimer's, and she's in a failing marriage. She's met someone new, and she's traveling to modern day Serbia to sort of research, understand, and connect to her family's history, with the largely undocumented history of the ethnic Germans, also called the Danube Swabians. The ethnic German community from the former Yugoslavia. There was a revenge expulsion and genocide against them at the end of World War II. So it follows Marie as she sort of comes to terms with a lot of this. And Marie's story is also interwoven with a series of short historical pieces, largely set in World War II era Yugoslavia. So I won't say too much else about the book. I'll jump into this quick reading, and then I will tell you a bit more about how I came to the story, my connection to the story, and sort of the writing process and the structure of the book, which is a bit unorthodox. But I'll just jump in. So this first excerpt gives you a bit of a glimpse into Marie's past. It's set in New Jersey in 1998. A girl went to the beach with her grandparents when she was 12. They rented a house past where the boardwalk ends in Ocean City, New Jersey. Amma spent the whole week inside the house, sitting at the kitchen table with her feet on the cold tile floor. She polished spoons and watched a portable television with a screen the size of a toaster, and Appa sat diagonally across from her. He did crossword puzzles. The girl woke up extra early in the mornings to listen for the sound of his pencil on soft paper. There were half-finished crossword magazines everywhere, with no earmarks in the covers or the pages, only occasional paper clips marking where he'd left off. The girl liked to fill sloppy letters in the empty boxes when he wasn't looking. She loved putting letters in tiny homes. A few hours each day, Appa came outside to stand with the girl on the sand. His legs and arms and face and chest were slathered in so much sunscreen, his skin was the color of whole milk. So white it made his teeth look yellow. The girl ran around the surf without any sunscreen. Her hair turned blonde while Appa wore an oversized safari hat to keep his from falling out. He watched his granddaughter carefully while she plucked sand fleas out of the wash and dropped them in buckets. He would line her seashells out to dry on towels. And when they went back to the house in the afternoon, Amma was waiting to scrub the shells clean with soap. She picked out the bits of sea glass and threw them away, and shrieked when her granddaughter showed off the captive fleas. "They tickle your hands," the girl said. "See?" She opened her palm to show how the tiny crustacean burrowed its way into her skin. "Out," Amma said, and the girl sped barefoot through the kitchen with her bucket sloshing sandy water on the tiles. She opened the sliding glass door and climbed over the wooden patio fence, scrambled over hot dunes, and collapsed laughing in the surf. She named the sand fleas, one by one, let them tickle her palms one last time, and released them, watched as they burrowed backwards into the wet sand like little moles before the tiny waves broke over their noses. In the evenings, the girl walked with her grandfather to the great Egg Harbor Bay and listened to bullfrogs and stories from fishermen about sharks being born in the bay water with full sets of teeth. Local boys picked up beadskin toads from the marsh with their bare fingers, and she rescued them with handfuls of grass because someone once told her that human fingers burn amphibian skin. She played ankle deep in the too soft sand until Appa called from the shore in his house shoes, a robe hanging open over swim trunks that never touched the water. Together, they walked back where Amma had citronella candles, bug spray, and mugs of mint chocolate chip ice cream waiting on the patio. One morning, Appa looked at the sun on the water and squinted. He told his granddaughter about the Danube. He told happy stories. One about bathing in secret in Hungary, another about visiting a village called Apatin to fish in the river with his cousin when he was 8. And then he grabbed the girl by the armpits and lifted her up, humming Johann Strauss. He propped her bare feet on top of his, put one hand on her waist, and held her right hand with the other. His pinky fingernail was longer than the rest, and the tops of his feet were soft and cold beneath her callous soles. As he waltzed across the wet sand, the girl could feel the tendons working from his toes to his ankles. Whenever he came to the part of the waltz that sounded like rocks skipping over water, Appa tightened his grip on her waist and spun the girl in a circle so fast her feet left his. So that was just sort of a thank you, a glimpse into sort of Marie's childhood. And like Marie, I have a strong family connection to this history. My parents were survivors of this expulsion, and much like Marie's grandparents, my Oma and Appa, while they talked a lot about the war and about their childhoods in the former Yugoslavia, they didn't go into very much detail about what had happened to them, what had happened to their communities, the horrible things that they saw. So in many respects, my research and my writing of this book was my own way of sort of grappling with and coming to terms with and understanding my own family's history. And researching for this book was a challenge. I interviewed my grandparents. I interviewed a few other people as well. But it's difficult because a lot of the people who survived World War II and in general, people who lived through it, we're getting to the point where not a lot of them are with us anymore. So a lot of those stories are disappearing. And research-wise on this topic, it's it's so undocumented. There's so little information on this part of history, this really dark part of history. And certainly in the English language, I sort of only found a handful of books on the topic, and a lot of them were written by people who had a strong connection to the history. So they were biased and they weren't necessarily reliable. They had a lot of understandable emotion, anger, indignation, horror written into them. So it was really difficult trying to write this book and sort of piece together these biased documents and the context around it. So I also, as some of you know, traveled to a lot of the places, all of the places that Marie goes to in the book, to sort of see Vojvodina, see this region of Serbia for myself. And I think it would have been really difficult to write this book without seeing these places. I think it was useful both for the short historical pieces, to see some of the places that were death camps where people were where horrible things happened to people. I saw some of those places, and Marie goes and she sees some of these places. So it was also really useful to see these places for Marie's story, as well as a historical parts. As for the sort of strange, unorthodox structure, because the story sort of weaves between the modern day and historical Serbia, between sort of someone connected to the story several generations removed, and people who lived through it. I started off writing this book with the short historical pieces, and it sort of, from the research I did, from these the books that existed that were about that were written by people who were connected to this history. A lot of those books were compilations of personal stories of people who survived, or they were personal stories told by family members, so relayed like secondhand. But those sort of short glimpses, those small glimpses into people's lives and these really, really horrific, difficult moments, it really suited telling the story in shorter fiction, rather than longer form fiction. But I was afraid if I only wrote these short historical pieces that I would sort of follow the same path as the limited texts that are available, and that it would come across as indignant and self-righteous, and that it would belittle the millions of people who suffered from the Holocaust. So I thought it was really important to find a frame story that balanced the bleakness and the violence of the shorter historical pieces, and the bleakness of the history itself. And I also really wanted to show what became of some of these survivors, the people who did flee. My grandmother, they fled. They were refugees in Austria for a number of years until they immigrated to the US, to Philadelphia. And then, of course, who they became, perhaps why they didn't talk about this history, and then the sort of multi-generational consequences of the trauma that they went through. So that's how I sort of came to Marie's story, and her journey and her seeking connection, and sort of struggling with loss and guilt and shame. So cheerful book, but I think I will take the opportunity now to read a couple of more excerpts. So the first of these two excerpts that I'm going to read now is from one of the historical pieces, from the perspective of a young boy who had been in one of these German concentration camps. And as these camps closed, any sort of surviving children were adopted out to local Serbs, and then in a lot of cases they were encouraged to let go of their identity. And then the second excerpt is going to be from Marie's perspective, as her and her sort of new love interest David are traveling to an abandoned village. that was once a concentration camp for Germans. So without further ado, this young boy's name is Avram. I can count on one hand the number of times I saw my mother in the 16 months we were prisoners. She said we'd stayed in Yarrick because it was our home. But after the neighbors moved out one by one, and the houses were all empty, and the silence in the village was loud, like wind screaming in all the hollow spaces, in the corners of rooms and streets and courtyards, beneath empty beds and through kitchens with cold ovens. You, the wind screamed. The wind also said that it is big and I am small. I've had dreams in which I am an infant and my mother walks me down the road in a pram. There are warm blankets the color of milk, and there is a shade, a beautiful black canvas shade that makes the earth seem knowable. All the edges are close, and there is no fear because it's rising. But then she folds back the shade. It's terrible. The sky goes on forever. It goes up and around. It goes sideways and forwards, backwards, and in directions that don't exist. When there was only one other German family left in Yarrick, I wrapped my things in a towel and stood by the front door. We've done nothing wrong, she said. We won't be run out of our home. The partisans turned the village into a camp. They marched parades of ethnic Germans from other towns through our streets, single file. They marched some in their nightgowns, others with no shoes. The neighbor's house was filled with old men. The stables were filled with German children. Mothers were herded into our own end. There was a house full of mattresses, one full of ladies' underwear, another full of stacked up furniture, chairs piled crooked on upside down. My mother slept 2 years on straw in her kitchen, but she didn't understand. We had done wrong by existing. I had done wrong by being born into a kingdom that no longer belonged to my people of the rotted blood. Jan says this was never the land of my people, that it had always belonged to his. But before the Habsburgs, it was the Turks, and I know Jan hates them as much as he hates me. He tries not to hate me. He wants me to be good. My mother tongue is forbidden in his house, and when I slip up, he throws the potato pot at me. Sometimes the pot is still on the water inside is boiling. Sometimes the potatoes are still in it and leave hot red welts on my arms, through my pant legs. One time, the pot hit my stomach and I threw up on the floor, but it is not so bad. I can eat as many potatoes as I'd like, and he reads to me before bed while I lay on my cot by the wood stove. He used to read translated Russian pamphlets to teach me Serbian. In those days, I was mostly silent. The pot was always on the fire. I remember one of the pamphlets he read to me most often. I don't know how long it took before I understood it. We are continuing Pasteur's work, who discovered the serum against rabies. We are continuing the work of August's method of deadly microbes. I'm not bad, he says, only my blood. There's a drainage ditch in front of the house that's full of water. When Jan goes to steal potatoes, I submerge a jar in the ditch. The jar fills with dirty water and leeches, and while Jan is away, I put leeches on the welts where potatoes have burned me. I put them there so he can't tell. I put them on me and I put them on my chest. I put them on the backs of my knees. I put them under my arms. There's a bucket under my cot where I keep them once they've fallen off. I fall asleep with them behind my ears. I put one in my palm like a wet dog's nose. I am trying to forget. I am trying to be better. Now he reads proletariat newsletters about Comrade Tito and the good he is doing for Yugoslavia. There is a photograph of Tito on the kitchen table and another beside my bed. The one in the kitchen is from the neck up. Tito's cheekbones and his nose and his chin and his forehead shine like those of the Holy Mother. His eyes look out of the frame as if he can see the whole of his country and all of his people at once. His face has hollow spaces at the corners of his lips, and the shadows tucked inside those spaces make his mouth look too big and hungry. He looks out at everything from his tiny frame and threatens with those shadows to eat you alive. He looks at me, and I say in my head, Don't eat me. I am trying to be good. My blood would make a poor broth, he says. My scarred skin would be tough, he says. And I have no heart, so I would be bland. The photo beside my cot is different. In it, Tito sits at a chessboard with shining leaf skeletons embroidered on his lapels. The chessboard is made of onyx and he's holding a black pawn between his right thumb and forefinger. His fingers are well fed, and the way his hair is slicked back crooked makes him look unconquerable. The shadows in the hollows of his lips are so deep, he must have life frowning. My mother had hollows there too. I noticed dark pits at the corners of her lips after my birth father was shot. Spread while she lived in the room with the other mothers. Sometimes the sun buried such big face that she looked like she'd grown a mustache. Thank you very much. And then this is the second excerpt. Thank you. Again, so this is Marie and David traveling to a village called Mollin that was once a concentration camp and has been abandoned since since the 1950s. The next building David and I walked into looked like it had been a home. It had no essentials, no doors, appliances, or plumbing. There were white splotches on the kitchen walls where sinks and cabinets and countertops had been. The rest of the room was painted seafoam green. A shoe sat in the middle of the floor, a black sneaker with mud and laces. Everything was missing part of itself. The structure of the house felt comfortable. Big sunny windows, high ceilings, a layout that flowed from one room to the next. There was something sinister in the comfort. A sunny doorway with no way to shut the night out. A hallway with pale pink walls and nail holes like tiny black eyes. Windows with hinges to open in the springtime, except half the panes were gone. Cracked tile floors with mud and discarded paper strewn across them. David picked up one of the papers. I did too. A bill from 1998. That explains the concrete posts where the lane widens, David said. What posts? The ones that blend in with the wheat field, he said. They were built to stop tanks. I couldn't imagine Mollin serving a purpose after 3,000 dying breaths blew against them. After it had flooded and stained and crumbled, but it had. And the sugar factory in Zrenjanin was still a sugar factory, even if it was asleep. And up at home on Anita Drive to escape, but I'd returned to Vojvodina. The fox in the ruins was just that, an animal living in human wreckage. No history was separate from our violence. No history ended. Wind pressed against the walls of the old house. I felt the pressure in my eardrums. This would have been a perfect hideout, David said. We flipped through more of the papers on the floor, annotated in Serbo-Croatian. Maybe whoever hid in Mollin in the 90s knew that it used to be a death camp, or at least gave the abandoned village a new history, one of survival instead of loss. A crunch fell outside the open window like a footstep. David looked up. Did you hear that? I asked. I heard it again, and the whispers. David looked nervous. He dropped the paper in his hands. Voices tangled in the overgrowth. David, I glanced at the doorway, the open one with no door to shut. Oh God, why had I the idea to travel thousands of miles to visit a place that decimated my ancestors? It was naive and arrogant of me to think I had the right to come here, that it was safe. Someone knows we're here, he said. My mind flooded with images, an abandoned village, unmarked roads, strange men paid to keep Mollin hidden. I felt the weight of steel links on the back of my neck. David squeezed my hand as he tiptoed past me. Maybe the noises out the windows were just the wind, or birds hiding in the rafters of the other buildings to keep out of the cold. I took one last glance at the papers on the floor, so white and crisp for being abandoned nearly 15 years earlier. I was reminded again, time moved differently in Serbia. A horse chestnut tree stood sentry at the front door. Its shadow swallowed the doorway. David hid behind the trunk while he looked out at the lane, while I stood surrounded by pale pink and cobwebs and watchful black nail holes. Looks clear, he said. Maybe they made noise to warn us, give us a chance to leave. I stepped outside. In the sunshine, everything felt different, lighter than it had in the house. My fear dissipated. A soft breeze rippled through my hair and my scarf without stinging my nose with cold. The air was quiet, save the few quivering leaves still clinging to the horse chestnut. A single bird chirped from the direction of the outhouse. The sounds we'd heard seemed impossible now, but they'd been there, like shadows. Like the footsteps of a guard whose soul had been dragged back to this place, who walked the same terrible circuit over and over, while women cried under cupped hands and children breathed heavy from the weight of their bodies, while living people came to remind him that he was somewhere in between. Help, I'm here, can you see me? I can't stop walking. My legs are so tired, and this place is my nightmare. It never left me. All I wanted was for it to leave me. Please, I'm sorry. I only did what I was told. They told me these people weren't people at all, that they were something less. And I believed them. I was a monster, I know it. It was so much easier to become one than I imagined it would be. But we were all monsters then, weren't we? Have mercy. You heard the whispers, David said. It sounded more like a question. I did, I said. But in the sunshine, in Molin, there was no sign of men. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I don't know, Sarah, if we want to have people type into. Oh, I see that there's some chat.
Yeah, there's something in there. I mean,
oh, lovely.
Unmute themselves. So if anyone has a question, you could unmute and ask, or because I can't see everyone on my screen because I've got it on speaker view. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask or say?
No, it's interesting because there's quite a few people who are here who were with me at the beginning stages of writing this book and have sort of read drafts of stories and drafts of, well, some of them drafts of the novel over the many years it took to write, which is eight years from start to finish. So it's very cool to have some of those people here this evening. Oh, Amy has a question. What am I working on now? That's a very good question. I had been working on a new novel for some time. I've sort of been stalling with it since lockdown started. And I am actually working on a shepherdess memoir in essays. So sort of a story of how I ended up moving from Philadelphia to the Shropshire Welsh borders and starting a small farm. So so far it's sort of connecting some family issues and things with sheep.
Sounds good. Do I have to type my question or can I say it?
Oh yeah,
I'm terrible.
Sarah.
Hi. Good. I'm trying to type and I keep making typos. Okay, here's a question I don't know, Allie. So I love how your book weaves the past and the present. Did you have all of those historical pieces written before you started doing the more modern writing, or did you get that idea like halfway in?
So that's a very good question. And it's sort of weird. I think I'd written a good handful of them, I think, before I started writing Marie's story, but it did sort of come halfway through. But I think I had in my head, I'd written the story. I knew the historical pieces I wanted to write, even if I hadn't sort of written them. But then, yeah, I guess probably halfway through writing them, I started writing Marie's story. But they were sort of the very beginning and the heart of it at the beginning.
Okay, and what made you decide to do that? I'm so curious because I remember reading all the historical stuff and it just blew my mind. I had never seen someone in action writing historical fiction, and I thought it was so authentic sounding to me. I just couldn't believe it. So what made you decide you needed that balance with the modern story?
That's also a very good question. I think it was in part because those historical pieces are quite dark and they're very heavy. I knew I needed something to sort of lift the book up and make it not just this heavy historical thing that tells you this, horrible history about all of these people that died that we don't know about. And it was actually at Sarah Lawrence when I was writing, and I had a chat with a professor of mine, Mary Morris, and we were talking through. I knew I needed something to frame all of these stories, and I told her about this trip I was taking to Serbia. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you hear yourself speaking? This is your frame story. You need to write about a young woman, sort of taking this journey to connect to her family." And then from that moment, it was sort of like this. Someone pulled the blinds open and all the light came rushing in, and I saw the book and what it could be, and so that's how.
That's awesome.
Thank you. I have a question as well. Oh, hang on. No, we'll go to Ben's first. Did you find that the people in, I'm really sorry if I pronounced this wrong, Vojvodina didn't like to talk about this period of history? Is it purposely forgotten?
So that's a really interesting question. Thank you, Ben. I didn't, so while I traveled through Vojvodina, I didn't speak to too many people about this history. I spoke to a couple in particular, and they sort of skirted over it. When I'm not sure if people are either unaware or it's such a dark. There's so much dark history in that part of the world. I feel like certainly with the Civil War in the 90s, this history seems really far away. Why would you want to go back that far and drag all of these horrible things up? There was a lot of other horrible things happening, perpetrated by the Axis powers at the time as well. So I didn't find too many people from that area who were overly happy to talk about this part of history. But equally, I know sort of over the years, I've noticed there's a lot of Germans that don't necessarily know this particular history either. When Tito was in power, he actually said it was forbidden to talk about this history. There was a man that came forward after Tito passed and said, "Oh, I was a commander at one of these camps. This happened, and I've been silent for years because on pain of whatever would happen to his family or him personally." So it is a history that's been kept pretty tightly under wraps, I think, certainly at least until Tito died. And then after he passed, you sort of jumped into a civil war and history moved on. That was a really great question. Thank you. I hope that answers it.
Okay, my question is, you're speaking about the short historical pieces. You choose a lot of different voices. Sometimes you choose the voice of a child. How did you choose the voices to tell it through? Like, what brought you to the specific stories you chose to put in? Were there some that didn't make it into the book?
There were a couple that didn't make it into the book, but in large part, I think I just stuck with them and edited them until they sort of did the job, I guess. But that's a really great question about children. I think initially, I'm always sort of drawn to children's perspectives. I think the language they use is more open and honest, and sometimes wiser than grown-up language. But I also, a lot of these stories are from the perspectives of children because the resources I have. So my grandparents, for example, a lot of the people who were alive in my lifetime to tell this story were children at the time. So a lot of my research involved children's stories. So that's sort of a balance of those two things. Why so many of the historical pieces are from the perspective of children.
Great, thanks. Did anyone else have? Dennis, do you have something?
So I kind of have two questions. So sorry if that's like cheating, no. But it is what it is. So the first question that I have is also kind of going back to the way that you were able to braid together the excerpts from the historical excerpts and then the sort of contemporary travel story. And I guess I'm wondering, I know that was one of the challenges in the process of writing the book, was making those two things work together so that it felt like one book. And I'm wondering sort of I guess how you approached that in your editorial process, and what that was like for you. And then the second question that I have is about the fact that like a lot of that content is incredibly dark, as so much of that history is, and it's painful, and it's also connected to you and your family history. And so I'm wondering what the process was like for writing stuff that is so dark and so personal, and how you managed to kind of take care of yourself emotionally and psychologically while you were doing this, especially over the number of years that you were writing this book.
That's amazing. Both really amazing questions, Dennis. And that first one, it was, I think, one of the last pieces of the puzzle that fell into place in the last revision was sort of the order of how the historical pieces would weave in and out of the contemporary narrative. They sort of landed in a lot of different places, and I moved them around over different revisions. And it took a really long time to figure out where they stuck. In the end, it was really simple. I put them close to the, so say Marie travels to a particular place. I put the story about that place near, when she went there. In the book, which seems really obvious as a way to make that work, but it did take me a really long time to kind of get to that. And it was sort of the book went out on a lot of submissions in the US, and we'd sort of get feedback from people saying that it wasn't quite right, but sort of the continual feedback. I think writing a book is a community effort, as a lot of you I know. And I think getting that feedback and guidance really helps in trying to figure out how to make these things work and how to structure something, and what the reader's experience of it is, and how these pieces sort of fit together. As for how I cared for myself writing such dark and personal subject matter, maybe a slightly masochistic, but I think it was really dark. It was really heavy. It was the research, I think, was harder, emotionally more challenging to cope with than actually writing it. Reading the firsthand accounts of some of the really, really horrific things that people went through, which I won't go into. But I think I would sort of read chunks of it and then just sit back and digest it, and it would take me some time before I could go back in and read more. But in the writing, it sort of felt like, for me, because I have such a strong family connection to this and it's so personal, it's sort of holding my grandparents in my heart as I was writing it, I think helped me care for myself, just in feeling like I had this thing I was doing that was keeping them alive, even just me, that sort of carried me through and made it feel less heavy.
Great, thank you. Great question. Anna, do you have something as well?
Yes, I wanted to ask Ali about research. I do a lot of research on my on my end as well, and I am also aware of kind of like the vast black hole that you kind of end up falling into once you start researching. And it sounds like from your book that there's been a lot of research both within the historical context, but also going and visiting a lot of these places. If you can share some of the things that you've learned, and just things that you've learned in the process, and just talk a little bit about your process in terms of like, if you started writing it first and then did the research and then had to go back and kind of edit it, or you did all of the research and kind of sat down and allowed all of that information to process through. I was hoping you'd talk a little bit more about your process and kind of give us what you learned so the rest of us can learn a little bit.
Thank you, Anna. I think definitely a huge lesson is that there is a time to just put down the research and write, because you can easily just fall into that black hole and never come out. And often it's sort of like the smaller details that are like the giant rabbit hole where you're like, oh, what do people, what are sort of traditional Serbian foods or traditional Danube-Swabian foods? And then you sort of like fall in this rabbit hole of looking up recipes, and, it's stuff that doesn't actually, it adds verisimilitude to a book, but it's not sort of the heart or the meat. And I think I find that I would fall into those holes when I was procrastinating. And or like, if I was feeling like I was, definitely during sort of moments when I didn't need to be doing any research. I just needed to sit down and write. On the whole, I did the bulk of the sort of historical research before I sat down to write. And then just sort of, as I was writing, would sort of look up a bit more, do a bit more research. But yeah, largely I did as much as I could before I sat down to write the book. And then, pieced together bits and pieces and added them in after as necessary. But I think most of it sort of was living in my head before I sat down. I was really concerned about getting everything right, both because the story means so much to me, because it's a really, a not well-known part of history. I felt really, really urgent to me to not mess it up. So I sort of wanted to make myself as prepared as possible going into the project.
And the travel part, did you write that part already and decided, oh, I need to go see it for myself? Or was that something that was originally always planned?
So it wasn't originally always planned. I didn't know until right before I went on the trip that I was going to include the trip as an inspiration for the book, inspiration for Marie. And even the character of Marie sort of didn't form for me until, again, that sort of conversation I had with Mary Morris, when she sort of said, hey, there's a window in here for you to find the slightly lighter frame story. But yeah, no, so I didn't write any of that until I went there, traveled, came back, and sort of built Marie, and sort of, but even her story really changed over time with the book. The journey she made at the beginning when I wrote the first draft is very different than the journey she made by the end of the writing process.
May I ask a question? Do you have time?
Yes.
Thank you for that beautiful reading. I've always loved those tiny historical snippets that you have. And you talk really, really insightfully about your work as well. It's really great to hear. So my question is, if you don't mind me asking, I'm wondering how closely you decided to stay to your grandparents' story, and did you feel an obligation to stay close, or was it the opposite? Was it maybe freeing to go away from it so you weren't, trying to represent them when you weren't sure what they would think?
That's an absolutely fantastic question. And one that I think I grappled with a lot as I was writing the book, sort of, do I put more fictive distance between my grandparents and the grandparents in the book? And that's the wonderful thing about fiction instead of memoir, is that actually, I can keep the things I want to keep and change the things I want to change with these characters. But on the whole, they are very, very close to my grandparents, and their story is very, very close to my grandparents' actual story. That's sort of and for me, I think writing it, this maybe goes to this question about how I cared for myself. I think putting them in it as closely as I did, and feeling that connection as I was writing the book, really, it made the book mean more to me, and I think it motivated me when things were really dark in the writing and researching. But that's a fantastic question, Carol.
Thank you.
And I'm really glad you enjoyed the readings.
Did.
Have you got anyone else who would like to ask a question? I think quite a lot of people here have.
That's been wonderful. If anyone else has any questions, please ask. If it sort of trails off, I know we've got a few more minutes. I can introduce you to one of our house lambs that we have living in our kitchen at the moment.
So I did just wake her up from a nap.
But this is Rabbit. And she's almost 2 weeks old. She'll turn 2 weeks on Thursday. No, I think it's been a really interesting adventure caring for sheep and sort of having the responsibility of caring for these animals. And it's a sort of great balance to writing, I think, having these little critters in our lives.
Well, thank you so much. So I think probably if that's it, if everyone's happy, then we'll say goodbye and round off. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for joining us this evening, for reading and talking about your book so beautifully, and again for everyone's questions.